Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's press conference. I'm Anthony Rowley, first Vice President of the club, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's guest speaker, Takeo Hoshi, who's sitting on my right, who's going to talk to us about the current situation in the Japanese economy. The title on your sheet says Economic Outlook in 2018, but he wants to change that slightly, to, as I said, to the current situation in the Japanese economy. He's chairman of the board of the Tokyo Foundation, which is described as an independent, not-for-profit think tank. Professor Hoshi is a distinguished international economist. He's currently a senior fellow at the Walter H. Shorenstein Asia-Pacific Research Center at Stanford University, and he's also a professor of finance at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. In addition, Professor Hoshi is a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and also at the Tokyo Center for Economic Research. He graduated in social sciences from the University of Tokyo and earned his PhD in economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Okay, well, I'm not going to elaborate anymore beyond saying that Professor Hoshi is what I would call a Japan optimist, so far as the economy is concerned. Please join me in welcoming our guest, and please, as usual, if you have a Keitai Denwa, please switch it off or put it on to manner mode.
Thank you. Thank you, Anthony. I need to start with an apology. I have a runny nose today. I just got here yesterday from California, and it was so cold. And after having lived in California for 30 years, I have developed an allergy to the cold weather. So every time I travel to the cold place, I develop an allergic condition. So I'm sorry about that. And I guess you think I'm joking. And I thought I was joking when I said I developed an allergy condition for the cold weather, but it's official now. I went to a doctor about a year ago and consulted with a doctor, and he told me you are allergic, or you develop an allergic condition when there is a temperature difference. So it's not quite the same as usual allergy, which you respond to some substance, but it's an allergic condition. And there's actually something called allergy or allergic reaction to the temperature difference. So I'm now officially allergic to the cold weather. Now, as Anthony pointed out, initially this was titled The Economic Outlook of Japan, I guess. And I changed the title because I figured I don't have any new insight or special insights about where the economy is going. So instead, I'd like to talk about the current situation of the Japanese economy or recent situation of the Japanese economy, try to understand what's been going on in Japan, and think about what will happen or may happen in the near future. So I prepared this slide, and here's an outline of the slides I prepared. I understand I have about 20 minutes to go through these, or 15 minutes to 20 minutes. I don't go through all of these, so it will take me more than an hour to go through all of these. So instead, what I will do is I just skip the background and just go into the Japanese economy in 2017 and just to look at some numbers to remind us where the Japanese economy is now today. And of course, a big topic for the Japanese economy in the last several years have been Abenomics, which is a combination of or mixture of several economic policies that the Abe administration tried to implement in order to revive the growth in Japan. So I will mention a little bit about if Abenomics has worked and where the Japanese economy is. And then I will want to focus on one issue, which is an important issue in Japan, which I've been thinking about, and that is a number 4 on this slide. Has Japan really come out of deflation? And I will answer yes to this question. I think Japan has come out of deflation, but yet inflation is very low. The BOJ, the Bank of Japan, has been targeting 2% inflation rate, and back in 2013, Governor Kuroda announced that the Bank of Japan will achieve 2% inflation target in 2 years, which didn't happen, hasn't happened. So the question is, Japan may be out of deflation, but if so, why prices are not rising? Why haven't we seen the 2% inflation rate or 3% inflation rate for that matter? As many of you know, the monetary policy of the Bank of Japan has been very expansionary, aggressively expansionary. The Bank of Japan has been buying the Japanese government bonds and all sorts of financial assets we can think of. But still, that we haven't seen inflation yet. So that's a question I've been thinking about. That's a question I've been finding puzzling. So I'd like to spend some time on talking about my thought on why prices are not rising, despite the expansionary monetary policy, despite some economic recovery that we are seeing or we saw in 2017, and despite the tight labor market conditions that I will talk about. Okay, so I'll skip the background charts. And if you want, we can come back to these pictures. So as I skip along, if you find something interesting, we can talk about it later, and you can ask me, what the hell was that? Okay. So let's look at what's going on in the Japanese economy. Where are we now? And many of these numbers are taken from IMF's World Economic Outlook. So for example, this one shows a real growth rate, real annual growth rate for the Japanese economy from 1996 to 2018. Well, 2018 just started, so this is not a real number. It's a forecast, prediction by the IMF. And the real number, I think the last real number is either 2015 or 2016. The others are forecast. And what we can see from this graph is you can compare the growth rate to the zero growth there. And we can see since Abe administration started in 2012, the Japanese economy has been recording very kind of low, but a positive growth rate. In 2014, the growth rate got very close to zero, and that was when the consumption tax increased. And many people argue that the consumption tax increase had a negative impact on the economic growth. But since then, 2015, 16, and 2017, the Japanese economy have been recovering. So the growth rate is not quite 2%, but approaching 2%. Okay? And the deflation, in the last 20 years or so, Japanese economy has been characterized by deflation or negative inflation rate. And this figure confirms that as well. This is not corrected for consumption tax increase. So when the consumption tax increases, the prices rise. So we see some high inflation. But if you exclude those, we can see for the last 20 years or so, Japan often had a negative inflation rate. Not very negative, but negative 0.5% to 1%. After Abenomics, Abe administration started, the inflation rate had been mostly in the positive region, not only when the consumption tax was increased, but also other years like 2016, 2015, 2013. it turns out 2016 inflation was slightly negative, mainly reflecting the oil price increase or oil price fall during that year. But compared with before, the Japanese inflation rate is a little bit higher or came out of a negative region. And the output gap, which is the difference between the potential output and the actual GDP, so how much potentially the Japanese economy can make and what they actually make. So that gap between supply and demand have been shrinking rapidly, especially after Abenomics started, 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16. And output gap, according to IMF, is approaching zero. And there is also output gap estimated by the Bank of Japan, which I don't show here. And in the Bank of Japan's estimate, output gap is already at zero or maybe positive. And labor market has been tightening. This is unemployment rate. Unemployment rate has been falling and now below 3%. So that's even lower than the mid-1990s and came close to the unemployment rate of 1980s. And if we look at active job opening rate, so how much job offers there are compared with the number of job seekers, this ratio has been rising very rapidly, and now we have an active job opening rate of more than 1.5, which means for each person who's looking for a job, there are 1.5 job offers. So this is a very tight labor market, which you would expect to lead to a wage increase, but that hasn't happened very much yet. So this is hourly wage calculated from monthly labor survey. And this includes all workers, including both full-time and part-time workers. And what we can see here is the average wage has been very stagnant in nominal term, around 1950, 100 yen for the last 15 years, 20 years. It's been rising in 2013, 14, 15, and 16, but still the increase rate or the wage increase has been moderate, especially given the tight labor market, which is given in this picture, like active job opening rate. Okay? So summarizing, has Abenomics worked? And we can talk about the Abenomics as a demand stimulus and has Abenomics as a structural reform, because Abenomics is a mixture of both policy to stimulate aggregate demand and also the structural policies to increase the potential growth rate of the Japanese economy. So we can separate those two. If we do that, we can say that from aggregate demand point of view, Abenomics had some success, and that shows up in the shrinking output gap and also tightening the labor market. For the structural reforms, or also known as sword arrow of Abenomics, the result is more nuanced, and there are lots of things we can say or some complaints I have, but today, because I want to save some time, I will skip those. Okay, and we can come back to this if you want. Okay, and then I want to spend the rest of my time asking this question. So why prices are not rising, even though the economy has been recovering, especially in the labor market. The labor market has been tight. There are 1.5 jobs for each person who is seeking jobs, but the wages haven't been rising very much. Why? And the short answer, or important part of this answer, is that there are different types of jobs, and the composition of the jobs have been changing. So there are jobs and there are demand for the workers, but at the aggregate, there has been a shift from full-time workers to part-time workers, or regular employment to non-regular employment, or from high-wage jobs to low-wage jobs. So what's been happening in the last several years is the economy is recovering, so the demand for labor is rising, but there are more jobs that are part-time or non-regular, and the composition or the proportion of the people who have non-regular jobs has been increasing. And since the non-regular jobs have much lower wages than regular jobs, even if the wages are rising for both regular workers and non-regular workers, the average wage can fall if the more people shift from regular jobs to non-regular jobs, or if there are more people who are taking non-regular jobs, and if there are smaller number of jobs who are taking regular jobs, or some people are leaving from the regular jobs. Okay? And we can look at this, how the wages, how the average wages increase, and how is that influenced by not only the wage increase of each type of jobs, but also the composition of different types of jobs. Okay? We can do this by doing some calculation. Okay? And here's an equation which economists like, but I know the usual people don't like. So I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about this decomposition or this equation, but intuitively speaking, this is what we are doing. Okay, this is what we do in this equation. So roughly speaking, or not roughly actually, precisely speaking, the average wage in the economy can increase for basically two reasons. The one is each person's wage increase. Okay, everybody's wage increase. So that increases the average wage. Okay. Now, another way for the average wage for the economy to increase is if there are more jobs which have high wages and the smaller number of jobs with low wages, then the average wage increase. Okay. And that part of the way average wage increase, which comes from the change in the composition of the jobs, the high wages, there are more high wages jobs than low wage jobs, is called either reallocation effect or composition effect. And what this equation tells us is that we can actually decompose the average wage increase to these two effect. The average wage increase because each of the wages increase, and the average wage increase because there's a reallocation from low wage jobs to high wage jobs. Okay? And what is called covariance term, which is if average wage increases, if the wage increase tends to happen in the jobs which or in the employment which are increasing. Okay. So, and usually we can ignore the covariance term when we look at the short-term period. So most of the total wage increase is explained by what is called the within effect, which is each wage increases, so that's why the average wage increase, and the reallocation effect. And I do this calculation for 2 years intervals from 2008 to 2016. And what happens is that the total effect is wages there, and sometimes the wages have been falling. But the within composition, the within part has been rising, including in the 2014 to 2016, the 0.06% rise. So if the composition of the full-time or part-time workers didn't change, the average wage would have increased from 2014 to 2016. But what happened was a reallocation or the composition effect. The more part-time jobs, there were more part-time jobs in the market, in the economy, which has a much lower wages than regular jobs. So that meant the average wage fell, even though the part-time wages increased and regular jobs wage may have increased as well. Okay. And maybe an easier way to see this is this graph. So this graph shows the average wage in green line or solid line, and the wage for full-time workers for red broken line, and the part-time workers' wage as a blue dotted lines. Okay, and I use a different scale for full-time workers and part-time workers' wage because the part-time workers' wage is much lower, as you can see from this graph. So that typically, for full-time workers, average wage is at 2,000 yen per hour. For part-time workers, it's more like 1,000 yen per hour. And what we see in the last 20 years is the part-time wages have been increasing, but full-time wages have been flat. And there have been more part-time workers than the full-time workers. So that's why the green line, the average wage for all the workers have been stagnant. Okay? And this shows the number of full-time workers and the part-time workers. And the part-time workers number has been increasing. The full-time workers have been flat. So in terms of the ratio, the proportion of the part-time workers in the total labor force has been rising over the last 20 years. So this is one important reason why the wages are not rising today, even though the labor market is tight and the labor market is adding more jobs. Because those added jobs are mostly part-time jobs, and those jobs have very low wages compared with the average wages. So that means if the labor market tightness, the tight labor market condition continues, and if this shift from regular employment to part-time employment stops at some point, and this figure tells from 2015 to 2016, this shift, this adjustment from regular workers to non-regular workers or more part-time workers may have stopped. Okay? If that happens, so that the composition effect becomes not so negative, and if the labor market continues to be tightened, that we may finally see the wage increase. Okay, so that's something we can hope for if I want to be an optimist for the Japanese economy. And the high wage means lots of good things. It may lead to inflation, finally. And also, more importantly, the high wages increases the income of the workers, and that may lead to higher consumption. So let me, I think I passed my 20 minutes, so let me stop here, and I'll open up for discussion.
All right, well, thank you very much. As usual, we'll take questions from the working press first. If I may, I'd just like to ask you a quick question myself, and that is on deflation. You may regard this as heresy, but I'm asking it as a journalist, not as an economist like yourself. To what extent is the motivation of the so-called anti-deflation policy of the Bank of Japan really what it says it is? I mean, or is it to some extent a way of keeping the value of the yen at a stable level, which obviously maximizes Japan's international competitiveness? And on that score, if the dollar is now falling, which it has been falling quite sharply of late, what impact is that going to have on it would tend to raise I'm not quite sure what impact it will have on inflation, but the rising oil prices will tend to push up inflation. And that's going to make the job of the Bank of Japan rather more difficult, isn't it, in maintaining a monetary policy which I at least think is partly aimed at keeping the value of the yen at a competitive level, or do you disagree entirely?
Well, the yen, the exchange rate is also influenced by the monetary policy. So all of those are determined simultaneously. The deflation, one problem of deflation is it tends to make the yen too expensive in a sense. Because the deflation means the value of the currency continues to go up. Okay. So the anti-deflation policy must be the policy, or as a result of anti-deflation policy, the yen exchange rate needs to depreciate. So it's hard to distinguish the two policies. Either way, the anti-deflation policy or policies that leads to the depreciation of yen. So neither of those are really the goal. The goal is to stimulate the demand, aggregate demand for the economy so that the Japanese economy can recover, the Japanese economy can fill the output gap and starts to recover. So it's not so much an issue. I'm sure some politicians in Japan interprets the BOJ's policy or wants BOJ's to depreciate yen. But that's something that happens even if the BOJ doesn't consider the exchange rate as a goal, but if they are looking at deflation or the inflation rate.
Okay. All right. Questions, please, from the working press first. Do we have any questions from working press? No questions? All right. Well, in that case, I will open up the floor to questions from anyone who cares to ask a question. So, a gentleman over here at the back. Can you come up to the front and could you give your name, please, and your company or affiliation? Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation. I'm John Armand from the Canadian Embassy. I'm just interested in your looking at the full-time and part-time workers. How should we think about those jobs? Are those part-time jobs the same types of jobs as the full-time jobs, just done at a lower rate, or are they completely different segments of the economy? And I'd also be interested to know what kind of impact is demographics having on that labor market change? Okay.
So these jobs are probably different jobs. In some cases, it's just the same job at a lower rate. But there are some usually some differences. The wages are lower, and at the same time, and also from firm's point of view, the part-time workers are easier to adjust than full-time workers. So that's there's that difference, and there are some studies which shows the productivity of the part-time jobs is lower than the full-time jobs. So there seems to be that difference as well. And so I'm sure it depends on which company to talk about, but in general, I think the full-time jobs and part-time jobs are different. And the last 20 years is, what's been happening in the last 20 years is the Japanese companies have been adjusting their mix of the full-time workers to part-time workers in order to reach the optimal combination of those two. And your demographic question.
Yes.
So your question is implication of the demography for full-time, part-time thing, or?
Yes, exactly. So I assume some of the productivity or even inflation numbers you're referring to are affected by the demographic shift and spending and productivity of the labor force. I'm just wondering if you have any comments on, in these types of numbers, how big of an impact is the actual demographic shift on those trends?
Okay. So I'm not sure if this if I can relate this to a full-time, part-time worker differences, but I have a whole section of the demography and economic growth in this slide. And I can give you a brief explanation or the brief look of that section. Is that?
I would appreciate that if we're allowed, but perhaps specifically on the full-time to part-time and demographics, if I could ask. Could there be a segment of that population that's reaching a certain age, leaving a part-time regular job and going to a lower wage? Is that some of the shift? That's, I guess, my question on that part of it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's been a part of shift, yes. The many people who retired because of the mandatory retirement age, many people take a part-time jobs. So that has been, that's a one factor that's behind the shift from full-time workers to part-time workers.
Yes, Dawson, please.
I'm Martin Fritz from the German magazine Wirtschaftswoche. I think there are two options for the enterprises to react to this scarcity of labor. One is to increase wages to keep their people and to get new people, but the other option is to invest in automatization or increase productivity with machines and so on. How do you judge this trend, and will it have a deflationary consequence if the capital investment is going into this kind of robots and so on? Productivity is going up, but on the same time, of course, the process is getting cheaper, so this may depress prices.
So that's an excellent question, and so I expect the companies to do both. In the short run, they may have to pay higher wages, but it also higher wages increases the incentive for the companies to save the labor. So there is an incentive for them to invest in IT or AI. And there is a study by the Bank of Japan researchers which shows at the industry level, this is exactly the case. In the industry where the companies feel shortage of labor, they tend to invest more in ITC technologies in general, and including investment in AI and so on. So, and that means, so holding other things equal, that could be deflationary because the companies may not be, because the company can produce more by even if they don't get the higher prices. But the productivity growth in that sense is always deflationary. Okay. Now, if it could be potentially deflationary, if the deflation actually happens, it's determined by the aggregate demand. Okay. So productivity growth, either through investment in, either through AI or new technology or old technology, all of those can be potentially deflationary, but as long as the aggregate demand is increasing, and this is where the Bank of Japan and other aggregate demand policy can help, then Japan can take advantage of those productivity growth and grow much more than the deflationary scenario would allow. Okay. So I hope that's what happens, but their aggregate demand can be a constraint. Okay.
Just follow that quick point myself. wages have been slow to increase in Japan. They've also been fairly slow to increase in other parts of the world, but has Japan's international competitiveness gained as a result of this sticky wage situation, especially vis-à-vis China, for instance, and other competitive economies? Certainly wages in China have been rising, I think more rapidly than they have in Japan. So briefly the question is, has Japan's economy benefited from this sticky wage situation?
In theory, yes, but probably not. The Japanese, I don't think that many Japanese industries are competing with China or less developed countries in terms of wages. The Japanese wages have been high and marginally, or not higher wages in Japan shouldn't be able to help very much.
Right. Yes, please.
My name is Richard Susilo from Indonesia. So recently the virtual currency such as Bitcoin is growing faster in the world and also in Japan. So I would like to know your thinking about this virtual currency and what is actually the influence of the economy. Thank you.
Okay. I think virtual currency is a currency. So the value of that depends on the expectation those currencies are accepted. And if everybody believes those bitcoins are accepted, which I guess is the case now, they will maintain its value. But sometimes those expectations about how acceptable those currencies are can change. And this has happened to the real, or I shouldn't say real, or non-virtual currencies, the currencies we have now. And many currencies experienced inflation and recently deflation. And I think that will happen to bitcoins and other virtual currency as well. Now, if those currencies survive, I think so. I mean, we have many currencies these days. Those are backed by the government in the end, and virtual currencies are not, so there may be a difference. But the world seems to be able to live with multiple currencies. And now we are adding more currencies to this world. And so that's, I'm not an expert on this issue, but that's my view. They are not fundamentally different from the currencies we have today.
Siegfried Little, freelancer from Germany. I think the Japanese economy is still supported by the kind of BOJ policy, finance policy, by still a kind of a quantitative easing is still going on. I think is this not a kind of a non-sustainable kind of economy policy? Is a economy in good health if only it's functioning by supporting by the BOJ? And what can be done? I think I've read an article that quoted Mr. Shirakawa, and he said the Abenomics is no way to solve the crisis of Japan. He said more in the direction of structural reform is the only way to solve it. So should be on this way on structural reform to really to come to a sustainable growth in Japan?
Okay. So this relates to the part of my talk that I skipped completely. So the question is, So summarizing your question, is BOJ's policy is in the BOJ's policy may not be that essential for Japan's recovery, and in order for Japan to recover, structural reform is necessary, and that should be something we should focus on. So before Abenomics started, okay, the Japanese economy was stagnant. The growth was low, okay, and that was one of the pictures I showed very quickly. And Japanese economy was not growing. Okay. And there are two reasons why the economy can be stagnant. One is there's not enough demand. Okay. The economy can produce a lot, but nobody buys. So that's the demand shortage story. And another potential reason why the economy gets stagnated is the economy cannot make a lot of things to start with, even if people want, or even if people are willing to buy those goods, if the economy makes those. Okay? So these are both demand side view or supply side view, the demand side factors and supply side factors. And the economy can stagnate from a demand side reasons, the demand shortage, or from supply side reasons. The economy is not productive enough. Now, what about Japan? Which was more important? The simplest way to look at this is to look at the price level, the inflation. If the supply side is a problem, and if there is a huge demand, but the economy is stagnated because the economy cannot produce goods, then we should see inflation. If the demand side is more of a problem, we may see a deflation. And if there's no problem on the supply side, the people are willing to make goods, but they can't sell. Okay? So in Japan, what happened is a deflation. So that suggests that demand factors were more important. So that leads to the policy recommendation that they should increase aggregate demand, and the BOJ policy is one of them. But this is not the whole story. If the demand side was the only problem, what we should have seen is, so for example, looking at this graph, let's say the supply side of the economy were able to grow, and demand constrained the economy. So what actually happened is the demand, and what could have happened if there was the demand was this the straight line, the red line. If that was the case, if the aggregate demand side was the only problem, what we should have observed is not only the mild deflation, but the deflation spiral, the going into a deeper and deeper deflation, which didn't happen in Japan. So that suggests the demand side wasn't the only problem. There was a problem on the supply side as well. So both fell, so that deflation was at a moderate level. So what Japan needed was both aggregate demand policy, which includes BOJ's policy, and aggregate supply policy, which is a structural reform that you stress. And my understanding of Abenomics is a mixture of both, the demand stimulus and structural reform. Okay. And now, where we are now is that the output gap is shrinking. So the demand shortage compared with the supply side is going away. Okay. But still, the growth rate of Japan is low, which suggests the supply factors may be becoming a constraint for the Japanese economy. And this is when we need a structural reform. Okay. So I think you're exactly right, and Shirakawa-san is exactly right now, It's debatable if he was right when he was a BOJ governor, but his diagnosis is right, at least now, because now the output gap is shrinking, but the economy is not growing very high, so the supply side is a constraint. So they need to work on the structural reform.
You said when we were talking earlier that you're not worried about the decline in population here in Japan, but I mean, a declining population and an aging population seems to imply falling demand, doesn't it? So how is that going to play into the equation?
Yes, from demand side factor, the population decline can be a problem for falling demand. But what is happening now is that the demand can be increased by aggregate demand policy. Sometimes it's not as effective as we want, but what we learned, or one thing we have learned from Abenomics is as a demand stimulus policy, Abenomics has been successful. It's increased demand. So the problem is more of a supply side these days. The demand is there, but supply side seems to be constrained. So from that point of view, the declining in demand by the aging population doesn't seem to be problematic for now.
Okay, very briefly, what are the supply side constraints? I mean, without going into too much detail, what is holding back the supply side?
What are holding the supply side? So when we talk about the economic growth of the advanced countries, the economic growth of the advanced countries mainly comes from the productivity growth. They can't just grow by adding capitals, and or adding the workers is not an option for Japan. It's a population is declining. Mm-hmm. So the supply side problem is the productivity growth has been low, and there should be a way to increase those productivity. Okay.
Okay. Yes, Walter. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Walter Sim from the Straits Times in Singapore. My question really is with regards to the TPP-11. There was some good news coming out of Japan this week. So I was just wondering, how do you see the TPP-11 as being able to catalyze structural reforms in Japan when the treaty is enforced? Thanks.
I think TPP is an important part or important factor that can accelerate the structural reform in Japan. And that's one way the current administration has been using TPP or the trade liberalization anyway, in general, to push the Japanese agricultural sector to become more open and reform the agricultural policy so that the farmers can become more productive or needs to become more productive to compete with the rest of the world. So I think that's very important.
Anyone else before? All right, doesn't. Go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
And just a follow-up question to what you said about structural reforms. If you were the advisor of Mr. Abe, which would be the most important structural reform with the most impact on, from the viewpoint of an economist?
Okay. Now, so what is the most important structural reform?
You would recommend.
Yes. So that allows me to talk about one slide. Which I prepared. Okay. So what is important is the productivity growth. So the reform to increase the productivity growth would be the important ones. Okay. So productivity growth basically depends on two things. Again, if we look at the average productivity of the economy, the productivity growth can happen if each existing firms increase their productivity. Okay? Each factory increases their productivity, then the average or the overall productivity goes up. There's another way to increase the overall productivity. That is, the high productivity companies or high productivity production units increase their shares, and low productivity units reduce their shares. Okay, so there are more production done by high productivity guys and less production done by low productivity firms. Or even better, there are new firms. If there are new firms which have much higher productivity than the current one, and the low productivity firms which currently operates go under and exit the market, that increases the productivity of the market. Okay? So again, people can decompose the total productivity growth into these different factors, one coming from each production unit or each company increase the productivity, that's called within effect, and the productivity growth coming from new companies which are very productive, or exit of old companies which are less productive. Okay? And this is one of those decomposition we can do. What factors contribute to the total factor productivity growth or labor productivity growth? Okay? And there's one column I want to stress. That is the exit effect. So this is how much the average productivity in Japan increased because the low productivity companies exited the market. Low productivity companies disappeared. Okay? And that impact for Japan has been negative. What that means is that the companies, or the production units in this case, exited the market had higher than the average productivity. Okay? Or in other words, very low productivity companies stayed around, okay, and continued to drag down the productivity, average productivity growth. Okay? And we call these firms zombie firms for after the movies on the living dead. Okay? So making it easier for these zombie firms to disappear, releasing their human capital so that those can be used by more productive firms, that'll be one reform I would recommend. Among the reforms the Abe administration has been working on, corporate governance reform is related to that, to the extent that increases the pressure for the corporate managers and increase the pressures for the non-profitable companies to stop operating. Those can be useful.
Just very quickly, so I know you're here to talk about Japan, but you are an international economist, so I wonder how concerned you are about what's coming out of the Davos Forum this week. I mean, there's Secretary Mnuchin talking about a weak dollar being good for the US. There's increasing evidence that trade relations are becoming more stressed. I mean, does this concern you about generally there's a kind of optimistic outlook at the Davos Forum, but underneath there are these undercurrents, and also there's the question of highly valued financial assets. Are markets too high? You know, very broadly, how do you see this? Do you see the real threat to the continuation of the present sort of Goldilocks scenario?
I think we need to be cautious. When the economy is going well, there's usually a risk which may come from somewhere we haven't been looking. High valuation of the financial assets is, of course, one thing we need to worry about. I take your mentioning of the Mnuchin's word is worry about U.S. policy
Yes.
towards currency war, or the U.S. is now less concerned about the global welfare or the free trade or the free trade rather than the U.S. interest in the or the U.S. trying to take advantage of the trading partners. Okay. And I think that's another thing we need to worry about. So TPP 11 is one bright prospect there, because TPP 11, if that happens, that will impact. There will be an impact on the U.S. economy. Okay? As any free trade agreement, the free trade area has effect of changing the trade flows, and countries which are left out of free trade area lose, because some other countries increases exports within the free trade area. For example, if a TPP 11 goes through, Japan will buy more beef from Australia and less from the U.S., for example, which hurts the U.S. Right. So what exactly some people expected the TPP to do to China, the TPP 11 can do to the U.S., which may convince the U.S. the benefit of having a free trade, and they may change their mind. And there was a recent interview of President Trump, who actually mentioned the possibility of the U.S. coming back to TPP, if it's good for the U.S., of course.
Okay, well, we're exactly on 4 o'clock, I'm afraid. Time has gone very quickly, as it always does when we have an interesting presentation. Thank you very much for coming and spending time talking to us. We can't compete with California, but if you would regard this as a slight lure, this is a free membership, an honorary membership for 1 year, so please come back and talk to us again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.